When I stopped pleasing, I found rejection and peace between. Being accepted by others and being true to yourself, there lies an emotional abyss. There's a silent pain that often goes unnoticed, even by those who feel it. It's the weight of living to be accepted, even if it means being absent from yourself. A kind of invisible pact that begins early, still in the first affections. The first time saying no meant risking the love of someone important. And we learn. We learn to smile when we wanted to cry. We learn to yield when everything in us wanted to resist. We learn to silence our own discomfort to preserve the comfort of others. And this habit, disguised as kindness, transforms, without us realizing it, into an emotional prison. Stopping the act of pleasing, then, isn't a gesture of coldness. It's a gesture of courage. The courage to recognize yourself and your own desires, your own limits, your own values. Because there's a thin line between being good and abandoning yourself, between caring and erasing yourself, between loving and losing yourself. Seneca, with his firm lucidity, said, "Nothing is more harmful than molding one's own soul according to the molds of others." And perhaps that's exactly what so many of us have done. We've molded our souls to fit expectations that were never ours. Epictetus completes this journey with clarity. If you want to be free, learn to say no, amo. But saying no isn't just refusing a request. It's also refusing a role, refusing a mask, refusing the idea that we will only have value if we are agreeable. It's refusing the illusion that love needs to be bought with constant sacrifice. It's refusing the chronic pain of not recognizing yourself within yourself. And in that act of refusal, the seed of peace is born. There's an image that accompanies those who have spent too long trying to fit into others, that of a broken mirror. Because the more you try to please, the more you look into the other person's eyes, hoping to discover who you are. But the reflection comes back distorted, and you fragment yourself trying to adjust. The day you abandon that mirror, that external reflection, is the day you begin to turn inward. And in that silence, in that solitude, a new kind of encounter begins. An encounter with who you were before asking permission to exist. An encounter with what is most truly yours. And it is there, exactly there, that peace begins. Not the peace that comes from the external world, but the one that arises from the end of the war against your own truth. The silent pact of those who never say no. There's a specific loneliness that inhabits those who live by saying yes. It's not the loneliness of lacking company, but the loneliness of never truly being seen, because little by little, those who say yes to everything disappear amidst the desires of others. They fade away to only shine what the other wishes to see. They mold themselves, fit in, distort themselves. And even when there's presence around, the emptiness remains. Because there's no real bond where there's no authenticity. There's no true exchange where there's no limit. There's no love sufficient when it costs one's very essence. The habit of pleasing is an emotional addiction. And like all addictions, it stems from a pain. An old, often invisible pain that whispers inside us that if we're not agreeable enough, we'll be left. That if we say no, we'll be replaced. That if we set boundaries, we'll be seen as difficult, cold, selfish. And so, in the name of love, we sacrifice our wholeness. In the name of acceptance, we deny the truth. In the name of peace, we create internal wars that make us sick. Until one day, even without words, the body begins to scream. The Stoic, however, observes. They are not deceived by the false harmony that comes from compulsive pleasing. They understand that pleasing everyone is a sure path to becoming no one, neither for others nor for oneself. Because when you live to be accepted, identity becomes performance. And performance is exhausting, fragile, fleeting. And in the end, it doesn't even sustain the bonds we try to protect. Because relationships built on the fear of saying no are as fragile as paper. Wet with insecurity, they fall apart at the slightest touch of reality. There's a phrase that whispers inside those who people please too much. Don't leave me. But what that plea truly carries is, don't abandon me as I have abandoned myself. Because no one can offer emotional consistency from a place where their own presence is uncertain. The silent pact of those who never say no is, in reality, a contract with their own absence. And breaking that contract is the first step to starting to return to oneself. Not as an act of selfishness, but as the reclamation of a dignity that should never have been negotiated. The emotional collapse that comes after constant obedience. At first it just feels like tiredness, a vague fatigue dragging through the body and mind. But little by little, this exhaustion transforms into something else. into irritation without reason, into apathy disguised as calm, into a silent desire to disappear, not because one wants the end, but because everything seems to demand too much. And the soul, so given, so manipulated to please, begins to implode. The body feels it, the heart feels it, and life becomes a sequence of surrenders made with effort, not with presence. Obeying all the time, living according to the will of others, smiling when you want to cry, accepting when you want to flee, all of this comes at a price, a high price. Because behind all constant obedience, there's a sick emotional system. There's a wounded child trying to secure love. There's an exhausted adult trying to appear strong. There's a human being slowly falling apart to sustain what should never be an obligation, to be amiable all the time. The soul begins to scream within the body. And that's why symptoms appear. Pains no one can explain. Discouragement no one understands. An emptiness no distraction fills. The Stoic, however, doesn't seek anesthesia. They seek lucidity. And Marcus Aurelius reminds us of this with firm tenderness. Love yourself enough not to become a slave to others, because true slavery rarely has visible chains. It lives in small concessions, in obligatory silences, in gestures that betray one's own will in the name of a false peace. When you spend too much time saying yes to maintain bonds, those bonds cease to be affection and turn into handcuffs. And the love that should be a home becomes a demand. And the kindness that should be a gesture becomes a prison. And the presence that should be a choice becomes an obligation. And life starts to hurt, but no one sees it. Because on the outside, everything is in place. Because on the outside, you keep smiling, but inside, each forced gesture builds an abyss. Until one day, you can no longer sustain it, and everything collapses. Peace isn't about pleasing everyone. It's about not losing yourself trying to please just one. And that one, often, is our childhood self in the mirror, still begging for approval. When you recognize this, something changes, not loudly, but definitively, because the collapse that was once an end now becomes a beginning. The beginning of a love that doesn't demand obedience. The beginning of a love that finally starts from within. When they say you've changed, it's because you stopped accepting crumbs. There comes a moment, almost always silent, when something inside you says enough. Not loudly, not in a tone of revolt, but with the quiet firmness of someone who finally understands they deserve more. And that's when everything begins to change. But this change, though it's yours, doesn't go unnoticed. Those who are used to your constant giving begin to find it strange. What was once obedience is now a boundary. What was once a concession is now a choice. What was once automatic presence is now selective absence. And then comes the veiled accusation, you've changed. But changing, in this case, isn't a deviation. It's a return to a dignity that was dormant, a return to the awareness that emotional crumbs don't feed anyone for long, a return to the understanding that being with another cannot mean being far from oneself. And the other's reaction, often, isn't about your change. It's about the loss of their advantage. Because there are people who don't miss you. They miss what you did for them. They miss your convenient silence, your boundless availability, your lack of boundaries. When you decide not to accept crumbs anymore, it's common for many to pull away. But this pulling away isn't a loss. It's clarity. Seneca said, we should not live to be praised, but so that we have no reason to be ashamed of ourselves. Bibwis? And there's something profoundly liberating in looking back and realizing that you didn't betray yourself anymore. That, even if you were misunderstood, you chose yourself. That, even if you were accused of selfishness, you merely protected yourself. That, even if you were rejected, you finally respected yourself. The process isn't easy, because there were ties that seemed like love but were dependence. There were affections that seemed like care but were control. There were promises that seemed true but were convenience. And seeing all this with clear eyes hurts. But it is this pain that cleanses, that purifies, that reorganizes, because deep down, the biggest change isn't in what you do, it's in what you accept. And when you stop accepting little, your internal universe reorganizes itself. There are no guarantees that the other person will stay, but there's certainty that finally you will no longer abandon yourself. And that in itself is an immense peace. The metaphor of the bridge you were, and the moment you decide to cross it alone. For a long time, you were a bridge, a path between the pain of others and the comfort you offered, a silent passage where affections crossed, received, demanded. You gave of yourself without knowing how much you could. You sustained bonds that weighed too heavily. You extended yourself until you could no longer reach yourself. And while everyone passed, few stopped. Few asked how you were. Few returned. Until one day, tired of being a mere passage, you realize it's time to cross. Not for someone, but for yourself. The metaphor of the bridge is more than a symbol. It's an emotional state. When you transform into support for everyone, you forget that you also need to walk, that you also need to arrive, that you also deserve a destination. And when no one returns, when the silence of others becomes deafening, the truth emerges. No one can cross for you. No one can save you if you remain motionless. Epictetus said, "He who walks for himself no longer bows to please." And walking in this context is breaking free from the role that kept you in the same place. Crossing your own bridge is an act of solitary courage, because often there will be no applause. There will be criticism, distancing, judgments. They'll say you've changed, that you've become cold, that you've become selfish. But you know how much it hurt to support others while breaking inside. You know how much you cried in silence while smiling on the outside. You know how much you lost yourself in names that never called you back. Therefore, this crossing, even if it's yours alone, is also your rebirth. On the other side of the bridge, there are no guarantees, but there is solid ground, there is space, there is breath, and there is you. No longer as a bridge, but as a complete path, as a possible road, as a legitimate destination. The pain doesn't disappear, it reorganizes itself. The loneliness doesn't vanish, it becomes presence. And the longing doesn't scream, it transforms into learning. Because now, instead of giving yourself in pieces, you offer yourself whole, with boundaries, with truth, with peace. And that changes everything, because being a bridge was necessary. But crossing is essential. It's the beginning of the end of waiting. It's the beginning of the truest yes you've ever given yourself. Peace didn't come because I was accepted, but because I stopped rejecting myself. There was a time when all you wanted was to be accepted, to be seen, to be loved as you were. So, you yielded, you molded yourself, you bent to fit in, but little by little, you drifted away from yourself. And the more you were accepted by others, the less you recognized yourself in the mirror. Peace seemed to be there, in that pleasing smile, that expected answer, that rehearsed gesture. But it was an illusion, because deep down you knew peace bought with self-betrayal is always restless, until something changed. Not from the outside in, but from the inside out. An old fatigue, a persistent pain, a sigh that lasted too long. And then silence. A silence that made you listen. Listen to everything you had ignored. Your desires, your limits, your dignity. It was in that silence that you rediscovered yourself. And rediscovering yourself, in this case, meant no longer asking permission to exist. Seneca would say, true freedom begins the moment we stop asking permission to be ourselves. And that's what you experienced. Not a break with the world, but a reunion with your own essence. Peace isn't when everything is resolved. Peace is when you stop rejecting yourself. When the approval of others no longer weighs more than your own presence. When love from outside is welcome, but what sustains you comes from within. When you walk through old places, meet people from before, hear words you've heard so many times, and still you remain whole. Because now you are there by choice, not by need. By truth, not by fear. By love, not by lack. Epictetus reinforces, what is truly yours does not need to be bought with external effort. Your peace today is yours, not because they accepted you, but because you finally chose yourself. You chose with firmness, with gentleness, with presence. And this silent choice, this choice repeated every day, is what sustains your reconstruction. There is no more war with the mirror. There is no more hunger for validation. There is serenity. There is a home within you. And this home, this inner house built with honesty and self-love, is where your soul can now rest, without masks, without performance, in peace.